Welcome to our fifth annual Martin Luther King Day celebration. I am Charles Nazarian, president of the Gloucester Meetinghouse Foundation, and it's my honor to greet you today, January 18th, 2021. The members of the GMF board, the events committee, and I all wish that we could be welcoming you within the walls of our historic meetinghouse, as we have done in the past. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic makes it impossible to be physically together safely, but we are very glad you have joined us online. This year, the theme of our celebration is Local Voices. In past years, we presented full afternoons with learned historians, distinguished keynote speakers, stirring live music, and audiovisual presentations. But this year, our much briefer program will concentrate on listening to our Cape End friends and neighbors in short videos as they contribute to a conversation about race and diversity from their own experience. Like a quilt made of many fabrics, we hope that the different messages they share will be inspiring and meaningful to you as a whole. This year marked the passing of several civil rights icons, most recently the great John Lewis, who had become the conscience of the United States Congress. We will remember his personal sacrifice and the different generations who, often at their peril, contributed to our nation's struggle to live up to its promise of equal rights, social justice, and individual freedom. And as always, we will celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by listening to his words and with images of his life. His stirring speeches and heartfelt writing inspired a whole generation to rise up and oppose injustice wherever it may be found in our society, using the power of nonviolent protest. His actions and the actions of countless others who were drawn to work with him changed America forever. But as we know all too well from the past few years, those rights and freedoms must be guarded and preserved in our own time. We hope you will enjoy our program, including a segment near the end about how you may join your neighbors who are working for greater social justice and equality. We look forward to a time when, in the not too distant future, we can safely gather in person again as a community. Please visit our website, gloucestermeetinghouse.org, to find out about future programming, membership, and progress with the ongoing restoration of the Meeting House and grounds. And thank you again for tuning in.
As a person of color, how angry am I? All the things that I see, all the things that happen, will that feeling of anger push me to violence? Will it push me to not acceptance? Will it push me to blindness to progress that's being made while it's sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Sometimes maybe even a half step forward and 3 steps back. That feeling of anger, how productive will it be in what I want to fight for? I've got a 6-year-old son, and even before he was 6, I remember, kids ask you all sorts of questions, and he asked me, Dad, why are black people called black? And you think about your answer to that, and of course you're going to start with skin color, but you realize that question and the answer you're going to give is so much more than simply skin color. It's a lot more. And so you just look at your kids. You want to answer these questions, you want to prepare them, and sometimes you just don't know.
My little daughter loves to ride to the airport with me. And as we pass on the expressway going to the airport in Atlanta, we pass by what is known as Fun Town. And as we pass Funtown so often in the car, she would look over to me and say, "Daddy, I want to go to Funtown." Well, I could always evade the question when we were going by in the automobile because we were passing by and I could jump to another subject. Then the other day we were at home and she was looking at television and they were advertising Funtown, and she ran downstairs and said, "I want you to take me to Funtown." No, I stood there speechless. How could I explain to a little 6-year-old girl that she couldn't go to Funtown because of the color of her skin? And I looked at her and I said, "Yolanda, some people don't do the right things. They don't allow colored children to go to Funtown." I didn't want her to grow up with a sense of hatred and bitterness in her heart, and so I had to rush on and say, "But now all white people aren't like this. There are some white people right here in Atlanta who would like for you to go to Funtown, and there are some all over the country who are right on this issue." And I saw tears flowing from my eyes at that point. I said, "Yoki, even though you can't go to Funtown, I want you to know that you are as good as anybody who goes into Funtown."
In 1957, when I was 17 years old, I wrote a letter to Dr. King. I didn't tell my mother, my father, and my brothers and sisters. He wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery. I wanted to attend a little school about 10 miles from my home that didn't admit black students. So he wanted to help me. And in the process, we became friends.
I was very young, 23 years old, had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter. I saw hundreds and hundreds of young people. And something said to me, "Go for it." And I opened my mouth and I started speaking.
We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here, for they're receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
We couldn't be seated together in a restaurant at a lunch counter. We wanted to change that. We started sitting there on a regular basis. You'd be sitting there in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. Someone would come up and spit on us or put a lighted cigarette out in our hair, pour hot water, hot coffee, and pull us off the stools. We had what we call the do's and don'ts of the sit-in movement. If someone push you, don't push back. If someone curse you, do not curse. You wanted to project that it was something that the community could rally around and support, to help convince people who may be standing on the sideline or who may be watching that this is the right thing to do.
This happened many years ago, in 1963 to be exact, when I began attendance at Northwestern University at the age of 19 in a doctoral program in philosophy, of all things. Who knew? I arrived on campus, eagerly anticipating the near future, and I went straight away to the campus housing office. And I said, I'm new and I need a place to live. They said, no problem, and gave me a list of addresses and names and said, this is our approved university housing list. Just check these out and see what works. So, of course, I set out, and being terribly young and not knowing the area, I started to knock on doors. And my experience was universally the same. I'd knock, and a woman would answer, and look at me and I'd say, I'm a new graduate student at Northwestern and I'm looking for accommodation. And inevitably, the lady would say, oh, I'm so sorry. I would rent to you, but my neighbors would object. And this went on and on over several days of knocking on doors and getting an identical rejection. So then I went back to the housing office and I said, this is kind of BS. Nobody on this list will rent to me. And they said, oh, well, that's not our problem. All we are obligated to do is to provide you with the list. And we did that, and have fun, see you around. I said to them, well, in that case, here's my plan. I'm going to rent a tent. I'm going to pitch it on Daring Meadow. I'm going to live in it. And I'm going to call the press and notify them and ask them to come interview me. So they said, oh, no, don't do that. Let us get to work on this problem. And within 24 hours, they'd found me a room.
On the bus, my mother moves with us to the back. It is 1963 in South Carolina. Too dangerous to sit closer to the front and dare the driver to make her move. Not with us, not now. Me in her arms, all 3 months old. My sister and brother squeezed into the seat beside her. White shirt, tie, and my brother's head shaved clean. My sister's braids, white ribboned. Sit up straight, my mother says. She tells my brother to take his fingers out of his mouth. They do what is asked of them, although they don't know why they have to. This is Ohio, my mother says, and though we understand. Her mother a small lipstick dash, her back sharp as a line, do not cross, coloreds to the back. Step off the curve. If a white person comes toward you, don't look them in the eye. Yes, sir. No, sir. No, my apologies. Her eyes straight ahead. My mother is miles away from here. Then her mother's mouth softens. Her hand moves gently over my brother's warm head. He is 3 years old, wide eyes open to the world. His 2 big ears already listening. We are as good as anyone, my mother whispers, as good as anyone.
I attended Maryville College for 4 years, starting in 1962. The college campus at the time was integrated, while outside the Maryville College gates, it was not. Colored-only drinking fountains, bathrooms, and restaurants were everywhere. The list of exclusions was long. A white classmate in our integrated dorm one day popped the big question, which caught us by surprise. She wanted to know which bathroom the colored girls were using. Her question started an honest discussion, leading me to a much clearer understanding of prejudice. Over time, we gradually crossed color barriers on both sides. Outside our dorm was another story. Here is an example. A threatening note was tapped on my door because I had danced with a black student at one of our after-dinner dances. A group of us joined Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and worked hard through peaceful demonstrations to allow blacks to lunch at the Woolworth lunch counter, to go to movie theaters, and to eliminate those white-only drinking fountains and bathrooms. Yet, the Ku Klux Klan reared its ugly head, crosses burned, and white-hooded members voiced opposition to President Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The local police restored order, but that fear of the Klan's presence and the potential violence stayed with us. I graduated in 1966 and joined the American Cross Overseas program in Korea. I came home to Boston in 1967, a year of demonstrations and cries of injustice, culminating in April of 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King. Living in Boston, I experienced the terror of a racial mob. My fiance John and a friend decided to take a shortcut through Franklin Park to visit my family in Milton. Suddenly, we were surrounded by an angry mob shouting, "Get Whitey!" They rushed at our car with bats and screams of anger. John kept driving slowly through the screaming crowd. Miraculously, we did not hit anyone. Their pent-up injustice was slung at the three of us because we just happened to be there and because we were white. We were judged by the color of our skin and victims of mob mentality. Martin Luther King's challenge to me that I will not judge people by their skin, but by their character.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
He was just the warmest, nicest guy you ever wanted to meet. He would tease me from time to time. He would say things like, "John, do you still preach?" And I said, "Dr. King, when I'm taking a shower." And he thought it was so funny. He would just laugh. And on occasion, when we would be traveling in Alabama or someplace in Mississippi, you see a little hole in the wall, cafe, a restaurant. He would say things like, "We should stop and get something to eat. We get arrested and go to jail, we go on a full stomach." And he thought it was so funny, but I didn't think it was so funny. He had a heart of gold.
If my mother's mother wasn't born in Anderson, South Carolina, but in Hollywood, if my father's mother had said, "I'm leaving Ohio," and got on a bus to Chicago, if my grandfathers had wanted to fly planes and drove down to Tuskegee, then maybe I would have been born in a place where I could grow up to be a movie star, or a dancer, or part of some big and vast coming revolution. But my grandmother stayed in South Carolina, and my grandmother stayed in Ohio, so I was born a Buckeye, against a backdrop of coal mines and family lines. And maybe this was meant to be.
So in 1970, Doris had just had our first daughter, Isla Prouty, and she was wheeling her in a carriage in downtown Manchester. And she would walk down and so forth, so it's not like she wasn't known in the community. She had a big afro. And two grand dom-type Manchester ladies come walking up towards her, and they stop on either side of the carriage, and they look in the carriage, and they say, "Whose baby is that?" Thinking, of course, that it couldn't be Doris's, because Doris must be a nanny. And Doris, in her best Manchester potato-in-the-mouth accent, said, "Well, my dears, that would be my baby." And then she proceeded to laugh, and the ladies got, of course, embarrassed and walked away. But I think this is an incident that happens, the gap between what people experience as black people and what people perceive of black people on the North Shore was a wide one in 1970, and not too much has changed in those 50 years.
Because we have a right, my grandfather tells us. We are sitting at his feet, and the story tonight is why people are marching all over the South. To walk and sit and dream wherever we want. First they brought us here, then we worked for free. Then it was 1863, and we were supposed to be free, but we weren't. And that's why people are so mad. And it's true, we can't turn on the radio without hearing about the marching. We can't go to downtown Greenville without seeing the teenagers walking into stores, sitting where brown people still aren't allowed to sit, and getting carried out, their bodies limp, their faces calm. This is the way brown people have to fight, my grandfather says. You can't just put your fist up. You have to insist on something, gently. Walk toward a thing, slowly. But be ready to die, my grandfather says, for what is right. Be ready to die, my grandfather says, for everything you believe in. And none of us can imagine death, but we try to imagine it anyway. Even my mother joins the fight. When she thinks her grandmother isn't watching, she sneaks out to meet the cousins downtown. But just as she's stepping through the door, her good dress and gloves on, my grandmother says, "Now don't go getting arrested." And Mama sounds like a little girl when she says, "I won't." More than 100 years, my grandfather says, and we're still fighting for the free life we're supposed to be living. So there's a war going on in South Carolina. And even as we play and plant and preach and sleep, we are a part of it. Because you're colored, my grandfather says, and just as good and bright and beautiful and free as anybody. And nobody colored in the South is stopping, my grandfather says, until everybody knows what's true.
I'm a biracial child. My mom is white, my dad is black. And I was with my two white friends, and we were in a store that was pretty small. Like, I could see the clerk from where I was standing in the back of the store, and it was really tiny.
This morning I went and got a haircut, and the woman there touched my hair. Nobody else, just reached out and touched my hair because it was funky or cool, and they thought they had the right to do that.
And so I was walking around, and there were two workers, and they started following me, and I got separated from my white friends.
And then I walked over to Marshall's because I needed some sneakers, and no one seemed to notice I was there, really. As I walked the aisles with my backpack, the staff there didn't follow me with their eyes, and constantly looking at my hands and my bag. Nobody came up to me and said, "Can I help you?" So that didn't happen.
Me and my white friends walked into each other, and so we started talking again, and the clerks were gone. I could not see them anywhere. And then I turned around and they're back at the cash register, so I was like, all right, whatever.
And then when I paid with my credit card at the register, the cashier didn't look at me suspiciously and say, "I need to see some ID."
We got separated again, and they started following me again. And I didn't say anything, but it just made me feel a little weird because, I wasn't doing anything, and I would never do anything like that because I don't believe that stuff is good.
So that was pretty uneventful.
A friend of mine came to visit. His son was there, and my son was there, so they're playing around. My friend is white, so his son is white. I don't know if it was right about the time the Black Lives Matter movement was getting going or not, but I remember he asked me, what are you going to do to, how are you going to educate your son? What sort of conversations are you going to have with him to prepare him for interactions with the police or just with society? And it was a good question. But questions like that just, the assumptions that are built into that just make you despair because, I guess all you want to say back is, well, don't you realize how, in many ways, those assumptions and those expectations are just completely unfair? You don't have to prepare your son that way. You don't have to think about conversations you're going to have with him about interactions with society at large. You don't even have to think about that. You don't. You don't.
For the first 11 years of my life, I lived in New York City. It's a place where anyone from anywhere can come there to do anything. That being said, I grew up next to people who didn't look like me or didn't speak like me, and I learned quickly that that was okay, and that that's not always going to be the case when I meet somebody new. In 5th grade, I moved to Gloucester, which is a predominantly white town, which wasn't disturbing to me. It was okay. It was just not something I was used to. In 7th grade, my brother came out as gay. And that opened my eyes to realize that, yes, people that don't look like me and people who don't like the same people as me, they do exist, but sometimes they exist next door or down the hall. So in 2020, when the rise of the George Floyd protests came about, people were saying things like, oh, these problems don't exist, and that they aren't real, and that they're over-exaggerated, which may be true in the case for you, for yourself. These problems may not occur in your everyday life, but that doesn't mean that they don't occur in other people's lives.
It's important to face the reality of what racism is in our communities and to understand all the places where racism lie and how policy and belief systems have been part of institutionalized racism. And I think that once we start breaking that down, then we can really start to tackle how we face each other and how we deal with each other on a daily basis.
My son, who's 6, his generation, all of them, I want them to understand why we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. To understand that, there were those who fought, who were beaten, who were shot, who were killed for this particular fight, for this particular cause, which is greater than them, which was for our entire country, our entire society. They're gone now, and we need to always remember what they fought for.
I believe that Martin Luther King's legacy can bring us together at this time by really remembering what he preached about nonviolent passive resistance. I believe that the key to moving any society forward is a peaceful path to justice.
I believe that Gen Z is also doing a really, really good job teaching higher generations things that they didn't see as acceptable. It was never in their beliefs, or they were never taught it. I think we're doing a pretty good job trying to teach them.
It's sad today that we're not together because, boy, do we need to be embracing one another of what's happening in our country. Martin Luther King had a dream, and he thought his dream came true. And I don't think his dream was just for people of color. His dream was for everyone. And if I'll read some of his quotes, when it says, our lives begin to end the day, we become silent about things that matter. How many of us turn away when we see something happening? When you see maybe kids fighting or people arguing, do we turn away or do we speak up? The time is always right to do what is right. This is the time we take back our country for every human being. Let's stand up and stand up together, not only for Martin Luther King's dreams, but for all the children who follow.
You know, several years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. A black woman came up. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. The tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. From all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, Dear Dr. King, I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. She said, while it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze.
In the 6th grade, I read this book called Brown Girl Dreaming. It did such an effective and such a powerful job of bringing these huge social issues and these huge political issues from decades ago to a level that I, as a young person, as a young student, could really grasp and really understand, and it made them so personal. And I think it helped me, as a kid, really empathize with that period in history. You know, as I've gotten older, it also definitely has kind of showed me how important it is to have diverse resources in the classroom, because it enriches the narrative, the historical narrative, and it makes kids have a better understanding of both, American history, but modern America, and gives them better context and more accurate context for why their world looks the way it does.
Deep winter, and the night air is cold. So still, it feels like the world goes on forever in the darkness, until you look up and the earth stops, in a ceiling of stars, my head against my grandfather's arm. A blanket around us as we sit on the front porch swing. It's wine like a song. You don't need words on a night like this. Just the warmth of your grandfather's arm. Just the silent promise that the world as we know it will always be here.
We have to be engaged, all of us, as members of the human family, as citizens of this country. There are forces that want to take us back to another place. And we're saying we're not going back. We've come too far. We made too much progress to stop now or to turn around. I feel it is part of my obligation, my mission, to reach as many young people as possible. The fight is not over. We have to continue to fight. And sometimes you have to fight some of the old battles over and over again for the next generation.
As a Generation Z, the generation after us will be the change. We start the change, they will be the change.
The Gloucester Racial Justice Team is a diverse group of residents dedicated to creating a safe and welcoming city where people of all races are free to enjoy and be active in an inclusive, equitable community. One of our first initiatives was suggested by Bill Fonville, the former Ward 5 City Councilor. He recommended we begin by interviewing people of color. We are working to compile their ideas about the most important areas to focus our work. Our early findings from the interviews that we have conducted is that Gloucester is a relatively safe place for people of color. However, the absence of racism and the abundance of acceptance is not as prevalent as we all wish it was. As we are uncovering our causes, we plan to support the work of the newly appointed Gloucester Human Rights Commission. We welcome anyone who may be interested in joining our group and learning more about the initiatives we are championing to contact Nancy Goodman via email at nancy.goodman52@gmail.com. Thank you again to the Gloucester Meetinghouse for including the Gloucester Racial Justice Team in this year's Martin Luther King celebration.